Welcome to this webinar. To give you some context, this webinar, Dan and I have been doing webinars for NextGen Planners for around about 6 years now. I think we counted that we've nearly done 100, between 75 and 100, I think is what we counted, Dan, which is a bit scary. A lot of bad ones, a lot of good ones, a lot of lessons. And we're just basically going to put it all out there in terms of what we've learned about webinars. A quick story from me. So obviously, I used to run a financial planning firm, and we did a lot of webinars. That was a big part of our marketing mix. And I remember doing two webinars. I was thinking about this before I had this session. Two webinars came to my mind in particular, where I had, I think, 9 people turn up to the first webinar, and I think it was 150 turn up to another one. So we'd done it with a professional connection. And I picked up one of my top clients from those 9 people that turned up to that webinar, and I picked up no clients from the one where 100, which is just typical. And I think we're gonna talk about why I think that is, but basically it became a bit of an interactive session, and I was able to answer questions. So I want you to think about that today. It's not always about numbers. You're always trying to connect to that one person who's going to use your services. I think a lot of people forget with financial planning, it's a high ticket item. So one client from one webinar that signs up to your service is a massive ROI on a webinar, which I think is why I think it's foolish that financial planning firms are sleeping on webinars. I think it's just such an easy way to get a high ROI, return on investment. So we're going to get into it. We want you to ask all the questions as we go through, like we always do. We're going to leave here, hopefully not having answered all the questions. Either do it via the Q&A or do it via the chat. Any questions top of your mind, just go through it and we'll try and answer it. But what we thought we'd do to start with, we've got a few slides to share, is the process, and I think we're going to follow up with this in a bit, Dan, that we follow, in particular you follow, when we are doing a webinar for NextGen. 6-7 years now, we have a very strict process that's been, I would say, improved over the last few years of how we run webinars, and everything that we do is purposefully done, Dan. So do you want to just start with, we're going to break it into 3 sections. What are the key moments before a webinar?
Yeah, typical webinar style as well. You need to change your microphone because it's gone to your AirPods. I don't know what happened, but it's okay. That's what happens during live television, isn't it? Yeah, so beforehand, I mean, the benefit of a process as well as with all processes is that effectively what you can do is you can just rinse and repeat every time, and every time you get a little bit better at it. And what it means is that you don't have that kind of fear every time of having to start from scratch. So the benefit of a process is just that you can just start it again every single time that you do one of these. So the beforehand, for us, the most important bit now, and we've really picked this up over the last year or year and a bit, is the importance of the name of the webinar and the topic of the webinar. They demand as much attention before you even think about doing this, before you even start to put the title into the webinar system or whatever it is. The title has absolutely got to be something that's going to draw people in, and the messaging and the topic of it has got to be something really important. So we spend a lot of time doing that. Once we've got all that kind of organized, and once we're sure on what the webinar is going to be about, ultimately it's about then just getting it booked in and getting it promoted. A lot of the time what people do with webinars is they talk about them and they don't actually do them. So what we do first of all is get the date booked in, get it into the diary, and then we start to promote it as soon as we possibly can. The longer that you give,
how far in advance are we doing that? So I think that would be a good indication.
Definitely. So I think in an ideal world, you want at least, well, we always go for at least 3 weeks before the webinar. You don't want too long in terms of you don't want like 5 or 6 months, because ultimately people will just forget about it then. But there is a real sweet spot, I would say, like maybe 3 weeks, a month beforehand. But the most important thing is that you don't just do it once. You've got to repeat that promotion, and you got to repeat the process of telling people about it and tell it to everybody that you know. So, we send our webinar invites out to probably, if we're including our mailing list and we're including all of our people on LinkedIn and all that kind of stuff, we probably send it out to over 10,000 people. The amount of people that get an invite to the webinar is huge. And we're not saying, by the way, that you should send it out to 10,000 people, but if you get to that point, then that's great. But the promotion part of it is something that often gets massively overlooked. Is that crucially important? Is who you're going to tell about it, where are you going to put it, and how are you going to do that as well? So, and also there is a graphical element to this. I'm a graphical guy, I'm a visual guy, so I want this to pop. I want lots of color. I want it to stand out, to stop people from scrolling. So we put a lot of time and effort into making sure that the visuals for the webinar are nice and vibrant as well.
Just to say, we're going to focus on a lot of these points in this webinar.
Yeah.
So we're going to come back to a lot of these points in the slides, 100%. But let's have a quick whistle start. So we've organised the webinar. We do it via WhatsApp, don't we? We have a WhatsApp group where we brainstorm ideas in terms of what the hook will be, and we kind of come to some kind of conclusion. We then book it in. We pick a date that people can do. We then promote it, which you're particularly good at. We're playing around with some ideas that we'll talk about today in terms of promotion. And then what next? What else are we doing before that webinar?
So another key point for us is what do we actually want people to do after the webinar, or what do we want people to do as a result of it? So today, for example, you'll see that we've got a very clear call to action afterwards, and we'll talk about calls to actions as well, but it's about prepping that as well. So what is the action that we want people to take afterwards? In today's case, it's actually getting you guys to do or download a webinar checklist, but you can have as many of these or as few of these as you want to. Just try and keep it simple. So that's something for us as well, is making sure that we've got that very clear call to action, and then building the slides. Really, that's it. And again, we're not saying with this that you've got to build 50, 60 slides that bore people to death. I think ours today is, I'm just looking here, it's about 12 slides, something like that. You don't need tons. I know they're a nice safety blanket a lot of the time, but ultimately what slides do a lot of the time is they take focus away from you. So we try and keep the slides as minimum as we can.
Yeah, I think prepare as well. So have some preset questions that you're going to go into if no one asks you questions. Get ready for it. You obviously know your subject really well. So if you're doing the prep work, you're obviously picking the problem, you're defining, you're defining the problem. You should be talking about a solution during your webinar, but you should know that topic intimately. So make sure you do your prep work before you go into that webinar.
Yeah. And, if you're confident about something, then you've got nothing to be scared of, because you could talk about it all day. And so what we would say is, well, this comes back to the very start of choosing something that you actually know what you're talking about. That's the best way to get over that fear element of it.
Okay, cool. Right, we're on to the webinar. Just while we're doing that, I want the people in the chat to say, I've got two questions for you. Have you done a webinar? And say if it was a success or not. So while Dan is talking about what we do during a webinar, let's hear from everyone, whether you've done a webinar, yes or no, and was it a success, yes or no?
Yeah. So what you've done there, Ad, is pretty much exactly how we would recommend doing it, in that you've got to get the audience involved. A lot of the time when we turn up to these things, it's simply just somebody talking at us like I'm doing now for ages. And as a result, you get quite bored, your bum starts to get quite sore because you've been sat down for ages. You'll have another screen there that you're looking at and getting away with emails. And then before you know it, you'll completely blanked us out and you're not listening to us at all. That's what that can be completely kind of stopped by getting people involved from the very beginning. So asking them questions, putting in surveys, putting in polls to make them feel like they're part of the room, rather than just somebody who's just sat in a coliseum watching you talk for ages, because it's got to be more of a dialogue. It's got to be a conversation between the two. We don't always have slides. We don't always need slides. So sometimes we share them. But like I said, what they can do sometimes is they can take the attention away from you. And really, you want the attention to be on you rather than bunks of text or anything like that. So sometimes we have slides, sometimes we don't. And then it's occasionally we encourage people to ask as many questions as we can, obviously, like you guys are doing now and getting involved. It's up to you whether you want, well, it's up to us whether we want to leave them till the end or whether we want to tackle them as we go along. What you generally find is by answering them as you go along, it actually engages the audience more and makes people interact more. So I'm actually a big fan of answering questions throughout nowadays. I used to just leave them till the end, but now I'm definitely more on the side of answering them throughout. Because as well, if somebody asks a question and you take half an hour to answer it because you've got your own agenda, they've either forgotten about the question completely, or it's you've forgotten about the topic, which makes it pointless. So
Yeah.
we try and answer questions throughout nowadays as well.
I'm gonna talk about that further on because that's a bonus point I think you've touched on there. So
Good.
we've done the webinar. So we've done before the webinar. We're doing the webinar. I do think it's useful to use a framework for the webinar. So there's a load of different frameworks out there. I've got one here that I like in particular. So it's a guy called Russell Brunson. So it's a really long book, and it took me ages to read. When actually I should have just put it in ChatGPT and it gave me a summary of exactly what to do during a webinar. But he gives a really good framework about how to discuss a webinar, how to promote it, but particularly during the webinar, he talks about the questions that people are asking, which we'll come on to in a minute. So I think there's a couple of things you could get from a webinar, which isn't necessarily always clients or leads, which we're going to talk about in a bit, Dan. But I think if you go in with a bit of a different mindset to a webinar to educate and understand, I think you probably have a bit more success. Okay, so we've done the webinar. This is key now. What happens afterwards?
Yes, so we've actually had a bit of a kick around the bum with this as well in the past year or so. Is that follow up has got to be as quick as you possibly can. You want to remain relevant in people's thoughts for as long as you can and as quickly as you possibly can. So you might have noticed that if you've been in our previous webinars that we follow up in no more than 24 hours. We always try and follow up. If it's not the same day, it's the day after to keep that relevance of what we've been talking about and keep people engaged with the conversation. And that follow up can be simply just sending people a recording. If you can, we always try and give something away of value. So today, for example, like I mentioned, we're giving away a checklist, which is designed for this webinar. Sometimes we just, give people a scorecard to do or something like that, but it's just a way for them to actively do something afterwards. And then, of course, you can put in a call to action like book a call or something like that. But that follow up piece, as you've pointed out there, Ad, it's absolutely crucial. These aren't done in silos, and that follow-up piece is ultimately the most important bit afterwards. And if not afterwards, it's the most important bit of the whole webinar is that follow-up piece afterwards.
Yeah, we're going to deep dive into this in a minute, but what a lot of people forget is how much good content you've got from your webinar. So you've got great questions from the audience. You've got your thought leadership pieces. You've got the recordings. You've got the assets. So you've got one webinar could probably give you 3 months of content if you're being honest. It's just everyone says, here's the webinar, here's the recording, and see you later. And it's like, well, that's just not going to do it, is it? So I think we'll talk about it in a minute, but the after is just as important as everything else.
There's one extra element before we get into the slides. One further thing is just adding those people to your mailing list or connecting with them on LinkedIn or something like that, just to keep them as part of your audience. Because you really, really don't, especially if you've got like 300, 400 people signed up to your webinar, that's a massive increase in your audience. You definitely do not want to waste that. So adding them to your mailing list, following them on LinkedIn or whatever it might be, keeping them part of your audience is definitely something to do as well.
Good. We've got one question from Sam, which we'll come to in a minute. So any ideas on how to find people to attend your webinar? I think we're going to talk about that. Any other questions that you have, please drop them in because we're going to answer every single question. And if we don't know the answer, we'll come back to you. But we're going to basically lay everything out there in terms of what we know about webinars. So I think we're ready for slides, Dan.
Good stuff. Okay, so let me share them. And you tell me if you can see those ads. Are they coming through okay?
Yeah, it wasn't as good as you showed me before, but it'll do.
Nothing ever is it? So we've kind of discussed a little bit about this, and we'll I just want to recap very quickly why they are really good. Number one is that they establish you as a thought leader. So it's a bit of a kind of overplayed phrase, thought leader, but it really does, especially if you know what you're talking about, and if you can dominate that space of what you're talking about. They really do establish you as that. They're low cost, so they don't really cost that much at all, to be honest. You can do them on Zoom or Teams. You could actually do them for free if you wanted to, and they are incredibly simple things. They're important to get right, and they take a lot of thinking about. But really, all the webinar is just a presentation to a wider audience. That's literally all it is.
I mean, realistically, how much does this webinar cost us? I don't think it costs us anything apart from our
No, I
Zoom
mean, we
license.
we have Zoom webinars, so it's a bit more expensive. But I mean, you can do webinars on Zoom meetings or Teams or Google Meet or anything like that, which are all free. So the only thing that after that you'd need is something to make the presentation with. But if you've got PowerPoint, you could do it on there. So yeah, I think you could absolutely do them for free, for no cost at all. The only cost is time. So uh, and then number three is that they grow your audience. So we've already discussed about like making sure that you capture those people who are actually there. It's like a recycling system, is that once you've built that audience, you then recycle these webinars to them, and you just keep adding to it and adding to it, re-promoting to them, re-promoting to them. And eventually that's how you really grow that audience, is by just recycling these messages over time and repurposing for different people as well. So
Then
we want to
Dennis has
oh,
said we can see you twice, Dan. So you might want to adjust the view. I can see in the top right corner as well.
oh okay.
There's nothing wrong with seeing Dan twice, is there, Dennis?
I was going to say that, but then I thought I might sound a bit too cocky. So if they are so good, though, a lot of people say like they hear about them all the time, and we bang on about them and say how good they are. But like a lot of people have maybe said in the chat today, they've tried them and perhaps they haven't worked for them in terms of they whatever their goal was, they didn't actually get anything from them. So today we're going to have a look at maybe some potential, well, definitely some potential mistakes that you're making that could be the reason behind that. And I just wanted to point out as well that these are mistakes that we have made ourselves. So they're not just random ones that we've looked at on Google and said, can you produce, or ChatGPT and said, can you produce me a list of 6 mistakes that we've been working with the webinars? These are things that we've done over the years that now are no goes for us. We absolutely, these are our red lines that we have to get right before we think about doing a webinar. So I just wanted to point out that these aren't just random. These are ones that we've made.
No. And let's go back to the previous slide very quickly. We are working with and seeing businesses that are doing these incredibly successful. So we're
Yes.
talking six-figure sums they're adding through their business every single year because they're doing webinars successful. They're consistent, they know what they're doing, they follow a framework, they have a process, and they nail it. We also add significant value to our business using webinars. So I think you've got a free tool here that anyone can start with. As Dan said, there's a bit of time, but don't sleep on webinars because, or even if it's not a webinar, we could talk about the same view with a seminar, for example, which is a physical version of a webinar. Still the same thing. The idea that you are doing a one-to-many presentation with people who are interested in what you're talking about is probably the warmest kind of calls to action going, I would say, Dan.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, completely agree. So should we dive into the mistakes then in that case? First one is, I think I'm gonna give this to you on in this case. Wrong or no hook. What do
Yeah,
we mean by that?
I'm absolutely obsessed with this, as Dan will tell you. So every piece of content you have should have a hook to it, and it should agitate to a pain that your audience has. So if you ever go onto YouTube and you look at some of the people with the biggest subscribers, I'm obsessed with Mr. Beast because I absolutely love Beast games. But if you go onto his YouTube channel, he's got he's got tens of people looking at hooks and calls to action all the time. It is a full-time job for these guys to think, what is the hook? How do I draw people in? Because if you don't write that hook correctly towards your audience, there's no one that's going to be basically coming to your webinar. So there's no point in your webinar. So in every piece of content that we put out, we're very particular on it. And particularly for you guys who are building webinars, the starting point is, what's the problem? Okay. What is the problem that your audience has? And how do you write it in a certain way that brings them in to want to see the content? So that's really important, is you don't give enough time to writing the hook. So again, in the chat and comments, are people, they're telling, I'm hearing people are fairly successful or not successful with webinars. Are you giving yourself the time to write your hook? Are you thinking very, very thoughtfully about that hook for your webinar? We've lost the slides, by the way. Is that right?
I'm terrified now of me being on screen too much. So I thought I would take them down whilst you're talking.
Okay.
But yes, I think I completely agree. And what I would say is think about this from the perspective of yourself sometimes as well. Although you're not your target audience, is think about, would I be incentivized to join this, and almost like do the mum test on yourself and say, would I attend this if it was me? That can sometimes be a really good common sense way to check that you've got the right.
So to answer the question Sam has here, Sam Pitstock, any ideas on how to find people to attend your webinar? There's two things going on here. There is the ability to find the right audience for your webinar, and the ability to write the right hook for your webinar. If you combine those two things, you will find people to attend your webinar. So I would say it needs to be about 60-40 towards the hook rather than the evidence, rather than the audience. So I think focus on the hook first, and I think you'll have a lot more success. And hooks are about testing. So a lot of mistakes we've made over the years, and we've got a lot better at this. We don't always get it right. Is we're always testing different pieces of content with different hooks because we want people to see our content. So don't be afraid. Just try it out there and use AI to help you with this as well.
Yeah, 100%. I was going to mention AI. I think that's a really good tip. So number 2 is lack of promotion. So I think I'll probably take this one. We mentioned earlier that the lack of, or the gap in promotion can ultimately mean that it's pointless doing webinars if you don't do this right. You absolutely need to tell as many people as you possibly can, and make sure that ideally they are ideal target audience, if you can. And that they're relevant target audience to the webinar as well. So if you're working, if it's aimed at one target audience, then make sure that the promotion is targeted towards the right target audience for that webinar. And there's lots of ways that you can do this in terms of mixing it up as well. You don't just have to post it once on social media, or send one email to your mailing list, or something like that. There's loads of different ways that you can promote these things, and there's some quite creative ways that you can do it. Like little videos, for example. I know videos are kind of like the buzzword at the moment. Everyone's talking about them, and there's a reason for that, is because they're successful. And if you can kind of bulk up that promotion with things like videos, and make content out of the promotion as well, then you're just absolutely creating this content machine. So you might have noticed, if you follow me on LinkedIn, I did a video yesterday promoting this webinar, and that then creates my own content for my channel. And it's a really, really useful way to do it. But there's tons of different ways that you can do this, and it's not just sending an email or putting it on your social media profile. I think people as well, they maybe get a bit scared by inviting people kind of upfront to these webinars. So, for example, I've seen people over the years be very successful with actually inviting their audiences on LinkedIn to their webinars, and it works really well. They were scared to do it because they think it's a bit kind of like overstepping the line and a bit kind of salesy, but people turn up and people actually engage with that kind of promotion as well. So I don't think there's anything wrong with sending personal invites to people. In fact, I think it's a really positive thing to do that as well, especially if there's somebody that you really, really want to come to that webinar. I don't think there's anything wrong with personally inviting to them. But I just wanted to kind of the whole reason for this part of the webinar was just to point out that doing a webinar and not having anybody there is, yes, it creates you great content, but it can be quite a lonely place, and really there's not much point in doing it other than the content that creates. You want people there, you want that interaction, and you want that engagement with the audience as well. So make sure that it's promoted properly.
Yeah, so two bits on the promo. One easy bit you can do today for free is leverage other people's distribution lists. So speak to accountants, solicitors that you have pals with, send them a webinar, say, can you send this out to your newsletter or send this out, especially if it adds value. I don't see enough firms doing that, to be honest. Sorry, a bit of frog in my throat. Second one what we're playing with is ads. So, we're playing around with ads, on Google, Instagram, TikTok, and all that sort of stuff at the moment, just to understand what works and what doesn't. And I think, we're not experts at that. I wouldn't imagine to be experts, but we're getting better at it and playing around with it. So I think this element of experimenting is an absolute key mindset you have with marketing and webinars. So just putting stuff out there, seeing what works, putting it into different channels, testing everything and then seeing what works. When you work out what does work, you double down on it, which is great. So I think, leverage other people's databases and experiment with different channels is what I'd say for promo.
Yeah. One final thing on promo, just before we move on to the next one, is what I mentioned before about recycling. So if let's say, for example, 100 people join your first webinar that you do, make sure that you then re-promote the next webinar to, as long as they're a relevant audience, re-promote that webinar to those 100 people and keep adding to that mailing list of people who you're inviting. One of the biggest arguments for webinars is that increase to the mailing list every time. So try and do that as well. It's a really simple trick. No or late follow-up ad.
I think you should do this because I think you should talk through again, step by step, exactly, how many posts go out, what a post looks like. We can probably send a template, can't we? As well, that I think would be useful to a lot of the audience if they want it. The follow-up is absolutely crucial because if you don't follow up properly, they've got no reason to contact you.
No. Yeah. So what we do, for example, is we put first thing what we do is put the recording on YouTube. So today, probably, I would imagine this afternoon or maybe in the morning, we will put this recording directly onto YouTube straight away, so that it's there available for everybody as soon as we possibly can. The follow-up in terms of the people who've attended the webinar and have registered for the webinar, that is just a simple email from me. No need for any fancy software like MailChimp or ConvertKit or any of these systems out there. You can use them, but ultimately what we find is just by sending a personal email to everybody who attended is a really nice way to do it. It feels more personal, it feels less corporate. And the things that we put in there, like I mentioned before, we normally put the recording, a copy of the slides, because I don't know why people get all possessive over their slides. Ultimately, we don't care. We'll give you the slides so you can look at them afterwards. And then we also put a call to action in there, which sometimes is, like I said, a checklist or a scorecard. And then we also put a book a call button in there so people can book a call with us to chat about whatever it is that we want to talk to them about. And then in terms of the content afterwards, we normally have like a 14-day framework that we use for this. So depending on the quality of the content that comes out of the webinar, what we try and do is post at least maybe once a day with the content from the webinar. So we'll take snippets from it. We'll take little sections from it. We'll put, we'll experiment. Sometimes we'll share the slides. Sometimes we'll just share the person talking. Sometimes we'll just do a text post or something like that. Sometimes we'll do carousels. There's loads of different ways that you can repurpose the content. But we try it from the very, very beginning of the webinar, thinking about how we can repurpose that afterwards. Because then what that does is as Adam mentioned before, it makes it, rather than just this one-off thing that you do on a random Tuesday afternoon, it makes this a 2-week thing, a 2-week campaign that you're using with your audience. And all that's going to do is simply just, again, add to that machine over time. And it's creating really relevant content for your audience.
Okay.
One thing I would say as well is just that there is a bit of an extended follow-up to this stuff as well. So if somebody, for example, was really engaged, really active on the webinar and they fit your kind of ideal client or ideal target audience, to me, there's nothing wrong with sending them an email a month later, just saying, thank you for attending the webinar last month. I'm just wondering how things are and if you've got any questions following the webinar or anything like that. Really have a look through that attendee list, see who's in there, see the quality of them, and target those people that you really want to work with. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that as well. But the follow-up, crucial, absolutely crucial.
Also think about sending the recording to, again, your professional connections. So there's no reason you can't do joint webinars. So it's a great example of the kind of webinar that you're doing. And a title would be, so just a summary of what the webinar is, a recording, send it to some of your prospects, whatever it is. It's an asset. It's a piece of content that's very valuable. I'm just going to answer Sam Pitts-Tucker. When you say hook, do you mean topic of interest to prospects? So the hook is basically what brings you into a piece of content. So I'm going to give you an example of a hook, and I've literally just put this into ChatGPT using this guy's formula, and he's given me some hooks that say the 3 biggest money mistakes professionals in their 40s and 50s make, and how to avoid them before it's too late, or how to grow and protect your wealth even in uncertain markets. Now that's what a hook is. So it's basically saying, what's your problem? What you're really struggling with, and how am I going to solve it? That's ultimately what a webinar is. Where are you now? What's your problem? How do I agitate that problem with the hook? How do I talk about that struggle? And then I need to give you a solution about how you solve it. So this is the whole part of marketing, is drawing people into either content, and this is just a piece of content. So what I mean by hook is it's not a topic of interest, Sam. It's actually something that draws people in to read or watch your content. So, what I would say, start observing content that's out in the world, whether it's on Netflix, whether it's on YouTube. I asked one of our guys, didn't I, to go and look. I don't like him, but I asked her to go and look at the hooks on Stephen Bartlett's podcast, because his hooks are particularly strong, and he's got a whole team that is basically building hooks all the time. And when you start observing it, you can't miss it. And I think it's really important for everything that you do to start writing these hooks.
Yeah, I think if you think about it, Sam, the hook is almost the step after the topic of interest. So the topic of interest is something that you want, that you're going to be talking about. The hook is how to get people in for them to listen to you talking about that topic of interest. So it uses the topic. It doesn't necessarily, but it's not the topic itself afterwards.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's have a look. Oh, hang on a second. Another webinar tip for you: make sure that you're sharing the right slides. Number 4 is not using the content. So we've kind of touched on this, haven't we, Ad? But what does that mean?
Well, as I said before, you've got, we have, how long we've been doing this? 35, 40 minutes. We've probably got how many snippets in those 35 minutes? We've probably got about 20 to 25 to start with. We can repurpose that using AI. We can summarize it. We can write a blog from it. We can put it in our newsletter if we want to. So the big part of marketing is distributing content, and the webinar that you're recording is just another piece of that content. So I'm going to disagree with what you said before. I'll come back to you and Charles, in terms of, I have done webinars where literally no one has turned up. And they've been some of my best webinars because I've just used it as an experiment and just testing some concepts. I think if you go into it with a bit of a different mindset, in terms of, a lot of people go into the mindset of, I need to do a webinar because I need clients. They go into it with a lead generation mindset. I think if you go into it with a bit more of a mindset of, I want to understand my audience better, I want to understand the questions that they're asking, I want to know what they're thinking, I want to know what their problems are. And then if you can get that in that webinar, that is a really valuable piece of content that you can then use for the next few years, really, because you've understood your audience properly. So I actually I love the idea of having hundreds of people, but I go back to that previous story where I had like 8 or 9 people on. I got my biggest one of my biggest clients because it was almost like a one-to-one session, and I got to see what he was thinking and what he was saying, but not using the content. We'll go to Charles's question now. Do you guys use one of the AI clipping tools or do it? We're all about using AI at NextGen. We just are because it's just scalable.
Yeah. I mean, he's asking about like recommendations there, Charles. To be honest, uh, we could talk all day about AI tools and stuff like that.
Well,
Really,
we can mention a few that we use. We use Cast Magic.
yeah, that's
Um,
magic.
Cast Magic is a really good one. We're starting to use CapCut, aren't we?
Yeah.
Um,
There's Veed as well, which is good. Even Canva nowadays has AI built in, which is pretty cool. Riverside, there's tons of them. There's absolutely tons of them out there, and they've all got very, very kind of specific purposes for them.
Zoom also, what we're doing this on also has AI features that no one really uses.
Yeah, quite. And that's just for the video clipping, obviously, as well. But like, say, for example, we afterwards put this recording into ChatGPT or one of the AI tools out there and said, can you pull out the key points from this webinar? Or one of the Google tools as well, for example, they're amazing. Not only from a content creation perspective, but from an idea perspective afterwards of summarizing, that's also really useful as well. So yeah, absolutely use one of the AI
Yeah.
tools for
Keep the questions coming. No problem, Charles. We love the questions because
yeah,
they're the easiest things to answer.
definitely. One I think just on the content is which what I mentioned there before about having a framework for it afterwards. So don't just say I'm going to use this content afterwards. Actually put it into like a 2 week schedule or something like that so that you hold yourself accountable to it. Because if you just say I'm going to use this content afterwards, then that's in the universe, and nobody's holding you accountable to that. Put it in a plan, show how you're going to use it, and build a system for it so that you can just repeat that every time if you can do as well. Yeah.
Francis, are there webinars on AI on NextGen? I think we've probably done webinars on AI. We're just about to release an AI guide,
Yeah.
which we're working on at the moment. And we also have AI training within our business membership, which happens, I think, every month now. Heather Muller, who's our trainer, she does a lot of training on AI in terms of webinars.
Yes, definitely.
I think we missed a question, by the way, further up.
Yeah, I thought we did as well. Where is it?
So, any thoughts on running a core webinar masterclass on repeat? I absolutely love that idea.
Mm,
So, so what I think Sam's saying is just running the same webinar over and over and over again, and I think that's a great idea, and just getting a little bit better every time, just getting more knowledgeable on your subject matter every time, understanding the problems every time. Um, I don't see an issue with that at all.
no. Um, Yeah, I've seen people do that. Not so much with webinars, but certainly with in-person events where they've done that kind of thing where they just run the same thing over and over and over again. And the amount of stuff they get from them is like, for example, they do breakfast mornings or something like that, where it's like an open session where people can ask as many questions as they want. They're really useful as well. So I guess you could do that in a webinar format if you want.
I think the key here is you need to be doing webinars on what people are thinking and asking rather than on what you want to
Yeah.
talk about. And
And
I
the
think
really good way to do that is
that's the mindset shift, isn't it?
yeah, we were talking about this morning to a client where is the really easy way to do that is simply just to record the questions that your clients are actually asking you and then turn that into content.
Yeah.
It's a low hanging fruit for that kind of side of things. So number 5 is no clear call to action. So um, what we mean by call to action is something for people to do afterwards. It's the decision that they make afterwards. So for example, the simplest call to action is get in touch. But I think that get in touch as a call to action after a webinar is a bit tame, a bit boring, and a bit useless because they've already got in touch with you. They've already signed up to do this. They've already been with you for however long it is. So I think get in touch is a bit of a lame one, to be honest. This is where you can really, really get creative, and it doesn't need to be an overt one in terms of like book a call or something as kind of aggressive as that. It can be something educational. It can be download this guide, or it could be to complete this activity or do this scorecard, or there's tons of different things that you could do, and you can have multiple of those as well. But without a call to action afterwards, you do definitely just leave people in the lurch thinking, well, okay, that was great, but what's the point and what do I do now? Some people will take that call to action, great. Some people won't. Equally, that's fine, but you definitely want that really clear call to action after the webinar, because that's ultimately the point of doing these is to grow the audience and eventually to get more leads as well. So make sure that you don't miss that at some point in the process.
Yeah, so this is Donald Miller, isn't it? Storybrand. I put it on LinkedIn, I think, a couple of days ago. So he talks
Yeah.
about a transitional call to action. So something a bit softer, like a scorecard or a checklist, which we're doing today. And then you've got a direct call to action, book a call with me to talk about this service. So I think
Yeah.
you need to be offering both. And you'll find that some people will choose a transitional call to action and some people will choose the direct call to action. That also applies to most of your marketing. So you need to be aware of that, and also your website.
And yeah, you're right. I actually forgot those terms, but yeah, that's right. It's transitional and direct. But also by creating those transitional calls to actions. So let's say, for example, you do create a scorecard or you do create a checklist. All you're doing there is just adding assets to that machine that we talked about before that you can reuse, repurpose in the future. We built a scorecard for a webinar that we did at the start of this year, the growth ideas one, and we're still using that now with people. People ask about it, we send them it. We're going to be putting it on socials, all that kind of stuff. So it's not just a create once and use once thing. It's create once and use and repurpose often,
Yeah.
with these kind of things as well. So I love transitional call to action. I think they're really good.
Cool.
Um,
Any more questions as we come to the end? I think we got one more point, but let's get the questions in.
yeah, if you've got any questions, then please do. We've just got one more thing to look at, which is killer, really, isn't it, Adam?
Well, I think the killer is not getting started. I think, but
True.
once you're getting, it's almost like, yeah, it's almost like expecting to run 100 meters in less than 10 seconds is like rocking up doing your webinar for the first time and nailing it. It's just it just doesn't work. You have to do it. It's taken us years to get to where we are in terms of our webinars and what we do in the process, and we try and get a little bit better every time, and we've learned loads over the past year in terms of we've thought really deeply about this. I mean, and we're going to give it all away for free, so you can actually get there a lot faster. But firstly, get started, and then secondly, once you get started, don't give up, be consistent. And it's like
Yeah.
any element of life, isn't it? If you're consistent and you do stuff over and over and over again, you get better at it.
I hope as well that your message at the start and that you've repeated throughout this webinar of the fact that you've done webinars in the past where nobody has turned up, but they've still been useful for you. It
Correct.
takes that barrier down for people as well, because I know what it's like to have webinars where nobody turns up, and it can be quite disheartening. But if you think about the big picture and the usefulness of these in the long run, then hopefully that kind of brings that barrier down. The consistency thing for me is a kind of really important thing. Um, one thing that we've started doing is to hold ourselves accountable is booking the next one in as soon as we've done this webinar, or even booking it in beforehand so that we can promote it on our latest. We're not doing that today, but booking the next one in so that you can promote it on the webinar. And once you've told people that you're doing it, you have to do it. You can't go back. So you have to do that. So that can be a really, really good way to be consistent, is to tell people before you've even done the latest webinar about the next one that's coming up. But if you just do these one off, if you do one and then you do the next one 6 months down the line or something like that, they're not going to get the traction. They're not going to get the momentum that you need to actually be successful with these kind of things. You want to build these into a machine that's going forward.
And just to give you an idea of how powerful this is, so you spend this will probably take us about 4 or 5 hours, this
Mm.
webinar. So from
Mm-hmm.
start to finish has probably taken us both about 4 or 5 hours. And obviously we've got a bit better. I've got an opportunity, I think. Well, I've been asked to go and do a talk at PFS next week in front of about 75 people, which I'll do, but that's a closed number that I will speak in front of. Whereas when I'm doing this, I'll know that we've got obviously got a lot of people here listening. It'll go on YouTube, so people look on YouTube, all subscriber. All the content that we've recorded will be pushed to all over, potentially to the 10,000 people that we have amongst our database. So you're talking about an infinite channel here of, scalability of one to many, which I think is such a powerful medium is to get in front of the right people. Webinars are massively underutilized. And just being really frank, all the top business people are using them. And you see them using them all the time. They know it works. They know what they're doing. They've got a framework and they're doubling down. So I think my first, if I can leave with anything today, start doing webinars. But if you're going to do it, don't give up.
Yeah, I completely agree. So let's have a quick look then at what we want people to do after today, and feel free to continue asking questions throughout this as well. But what we want you to do today, well, not today, once we send this through to you, is we'd love to hear some stories about how you're actually using this as well, by the way. So we want, if you from today, if you take the message and you start doing webinars and you've booked your first one in, and that you've used this checklist to do it, please let us know, because we like to know that this kind of stuff is working. And equally, if you want any ideas or anything, then just send them through. But what we want you to do is complete our webinar checklist. So it's interactive, and you can complete it for every single webinar that you do, and it's based on our process that we use for webinars as well. It's completely free. We'll send it through to you tomorrow with the follow-up. But if you can fill this out, give it a go, and then, like I said, if you actually are doing webinars, please let us know, so we can get involved in what you're doing as well.
We've got another question, which I think is a great question. Any guidance regarding time of day, stroke which day of the week? Really, really good question, this. And that's something that I used to think about a lot when I was running a financial planning firm. We were doing it. I think you need to think very deeply about when your audience is likely to be dialing into webinars. So, for example, when we used to work with business owners, we used to sometimes do it on the weekend. I know that sounds stupid, but business owners generally deal with finances on the weekend, and we used to do evenings because we knew that they just wouldn't dial in during the week. So I think about that really carefully, and it's dependent on the audience, would be my view. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I agree. So we work with people who work with dentists, for example, and they're exactly the same. Is that they want it on weekends, they want it on evenings, Sundays, that kind of stuff. It all depends on who your audience is. If you've got this kind of like generic audience, then ultimately there's nothing really to lose than just doing a bit of trial and error. But I think really understand, you can actually just ask people as well. Like, you just ask your audience when they would prefer webinars to be. There's nothing wrong with asking them. Usually though, they'll just say, I'm not asked, unless they are. But I think you're exactly right, Ad, is match it with the audience. And I think also as well, if you can, if you're a type of person who has different energy levels throughout the day, like I am, as you know, Ad, is to match it with the times when you're highest energy, because these things do take a lot of energy to do. It's a lot to stand in front of people for 50 minutes to an hour. There's a lot of promotion goes into it as well. And you need to be at the top of your game to do these kind of things. So try and choose it at a time when it suits you, and there's a sweet spot between you and your audience as well. I think that's probably another key tip that I would give people as well.
Yeah, and something we haven't done, but I'm seeing a lot of people do in other sectors, is run the same webinar over, say, 2 weeks at different times and different days. So again, it takes a lot of effort, but you're kind of keeping it all together. So just giving lots of different people the opportunity to dial into the webinar is something that I'm seeing as well, Dennis. So I think you could definitely do that. You could have 3 slots, for example, that you're doing webinars on.
Yeah, love it. Great idea.
Okay.
Any more questions? I don't think we've got any more from the audience, have we?
No.
We'll just do a kind of quick sum up then. So what if you could give a real good summary of today, what would that be? The one key thing that you want people to take away from today?
Uh, my one key thing is webinars have a huge return on investment if you get them right. So get started, be consistent, um, actually focus on what the audience wants rather than what you want to speak about, which I think goes through everything, and nail your hook. So I want to see from this session people doing webinars, and I wanted to see really strong hooks. And if I don't see strong hooks, I'm going to come on your LinkedIn post and I'm going to say that's a terrible hook. I'm only joking. Yeah, really focus on that. What's going to bring people in. I think that's some of the key points.
Yeah, love it. So what we'll do then is sticking to our word, we'll get this posted on YouTube, so you can give it a rewatch if you want to. We'll also send some useful bits over, including that webinar checklist for you afterwards as well. Our next webinar is going to be next month, I believe. We've actually got one on Friday as well with Rohan. That's on our social media channels if you want to check that out. That's about our business membership. If you want to go and have a look at that, then please feel free to do so. But otherwise, have a look out for our next one.
We are also organising our next webinar. Will probably be with Score Up with Daniel Priestley, talking about lead generation. So we're just organising a date for that. So that'll be a great one.
Amazing. Good stuff. Yeah. And if you have any questions or anything, then just reply to the email that I send tomorrow. But yeah, thank you so much to everybody for joining us. We hope you found that useful. And yeah, have a lovely rest of the week. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.